So, as our fund said, there's some outlandish claims out there. There's some really exciting stuff that's coming. So, a lot of potentials, and so trying to give you just a little bit of insight into what you can see coming forward. And particularly when we get to the end of the talk, I'm going to give you some ideas on how to handle things when these people approach you, because they will approach you. You're going to the TNLA events, some of the bigger conferences. You're going to see these guys that have booths out there. And I encourage you to stop by, talk to the people, get an idea about what they think they can do. And once you kind of see some of this stuff, you'll get some ideas about how you can determine whether or not this is something that's going to be worthwhile for you. So obviously that is not a greenhouse or a nursery. A little bit about what we do. Like I said, not going to be a crummy commercial, but we do LiDAR and aerial imagery on permanent crops. We've got some different techniques. We look at yield. So we do a lot of almonds, citrus, pecans, pistachios, cacao. We've done, I think, 32 crops to date. None of them are greenhouse and nursery. I'll take that back. We've done a little bit of work in a greenhouse, and you don't have good GPS in a greenhouse. So, things come out looking a little funny. There are a lot of challenges on that. We may go into those sectors down the road, but right now we're not currently pursuing those. So LiDAR is a form of three-dimensional imaging. So you saw that pretty tree turning around there. So that is what you get from LiDAR, and you can directly measure things off of that. So we can come in and get a measurement of the canopy diameter, trunk diameter, height of the tree, a number of different parameters on that are useful. And then we also can take that and apply other data sources on top of that. So like the aerial imagery, we then end up with a data set where we know how big the trees are. We also know, some ideas about the foliage, the biochemistry of what's going on with those trees. So the idea being, when we bring all these data sets together, then we have a better picture about what's going on with that crop. And one of the things that we particularly do is we focus on measuring, instead of a few dozen trees, we're measuring hundreds of thousands of trees. So some very interesting data sets where I'm looking at fields that are 100, 200, 300 acre size fields. So being able to get measurements on every single tree gives you a little bit different idea about what's going on there. So I'm going to start with the take-home messages. We'll come back to this in a minute. So first thing, that is not corn over there, right? And very few of the things that you grow actually look like corn. Unfortunately, corn, soybean, those two crops alone really dominate the precision ag sector. And so, there's some knock-on effects then that come down to create problems when we're trying to bring that type of tech to horticultural crops. So based on the the complexities of your crops, a lot of these methods, they don't work, right? And some of them take a lot of manipulation to get them to work on your types of crops. So we'll look at some of that. I'm going to start with aerial imagery. So this has been around for a long time. Interesting enough, with airplanes and trying to track troop movements and everything during World War I, literally consisted of people hanging a camera outside of an airplane and snapping pictures. As airplanes became more advanced, we had better cameras coming out of World War II. We see a lot more advances in that, where we're able to do things a lot more quantitatively, higher resolution. Some of the things that were particularly useful were the development of near-infrared film or color infrared film. I'll show you that in just a minute. And then, of course, we've got satellites. So Landsat went up in the 70s, and we've been able to get satellite imagery for quite a while now. And then drones, right? Drones are very exciting. So, come on. There, oops. Okay. Okay, it helps if we understand what it is that we're actually measuring. So in any of the technology we look at, you need to go back to the basics. So part of figuring out the wild claims is if you understand what they're actually doing, you can start to discern whether or not this is going to be something that's actually useful. So in the case of imagery, we're really looking at the electromagnetic spectrum. So this is reflectance, so the light that hits the leaf, like such as sunlight, this is what bounces back. So when you're looking at imagery, you're really looking at the amount of light that has come back. So to get you a little bit of orientation here, we got red, green, blue down here at the bottom. So that's what we would see, the visible spectrum. Chlorophyll, of course, is going to absorb red and blue, but it doesn't absorb green. So you see peaks in here where the green light is. All right. There's a whole lot of other stuff going on in that spectrum outside of what we can actually see, particularly when you look at near infrared. So just past where we see red, you see that reflectance go up. So we're looking at 4 different things here. So the dark green leaf is going to be right here. It is very low reflectance in the blue and the red. The green reflectance, you notice, is not really high, but it's the ratio. What we're seeing is the ratio between blue, red, and green. So that ends up looking very dark green. The light green leaf that's up here, obviously a lot more green reflectance, but you have a lot of reflectance in the red as well. So that ratio changes us. So we're seeing that as green. We have trunk. Trunk is here. Necrotic leaf, a dead leaf, so you're appearing as light brown or dark brown. In this case, this is actually cacao, so it's got a very dark trunk to it. And then you look at the reflectance going up into near infrared. So everything down here in this visible spectrum is being impacted by chlorophyll. And then when you get past that, you're really looking at the structure of the leaf affecting what that spectrum looks like. So if you think about a leaf, a lot of air, a lot of water, cells, you have a lot of junctions between where the light is passing through that leaf and it's hitting water and then air and water and air. So it bounces around a lot. So you get a lot of reflectance coming back off of that. And typically it's going to be about half the light that hits the leaf out in the environment is going to end up bouncing back. The other half is scattered down below it. So that gives us some characteristic spectra that we can look at. Now, taking this kind of data, this is taken with a handheld spectrometer, so it's a little $30,000 camera you stick up against the leaf. Not something you're going to be running around your operation with. So what we typically are doing, we're using camera systems that are going to fly over the crop and collect data. And rather than trying to collect this wide spectrum of data, you're collecting specific bands. So this is a very common camera used in the agricultural industry. It's probably the most popular. It's our sensor of choice for our company. And rather than getting that fancy spectra, you're actually getting 5 discrete bands. So there's 5 cameras there. Each one of them has some filters on it that are going to absorb in specific spectra. So we've got the blue light, and that's capturing a range in here. So it's fairly similar to what we would get when you use a regular camera like this, red, green, blue camera. You're going to get that blue band in there. We have green, and we have red. When we start getting into red and red edge, we're getting much narrower bands. If you remember going back here, there's a lot going on right in here in this red region. This rapid increase here, what they call red edge. So as you start making changes here in chlorophyll content and things, you get a lot of changes in here. So I went the wrong direction. There we go. So we've got fairly narrow bands for this camera for those 2 bands that are in red and just in the near infrared. And then kind of the normal near infrared range, you have another broad band. So the images that come out of this, instead of 3 layers, red, green, blue, you've got 5 layers for this one. And then as we go to do analysis on this, we're doing a lot of math. So we're doing ratios between red and the near infrared, and that's going to help us see leaves versus other stuff. So the near infrared becomes very important for crops because of that high reflectance compared to other things. So when we come back over here again, so this ratio of red here to near infrared, the leaves are going to give you a very high ratio on that, whereas your trunk and your stems, your soil, things like that are all going to give you a very low reflectance. So, so we start off, we've got that imagery going back to World War I. That photo I showed was actually Phytotoxicum root rot done by USDA down at College Station in the teens sometime. So again, literally camera stuck out the airplane snapping photos. So we've had this for a long time, and it's kind of the reaction from growers has been kind of meh. We can identify areas in the field that are not doing as well. But what do you do about that? So for a long time, the main thing has been, okay, we know an area that we can go scout. We walk out to the field, we look at it and go, yeah, these plants are a little bit more yellow than the plants over here. A lot of times it's differences so slight you really can't see it very well by eye, so you would literally go to a spot in the imagery where you see something going on, you pull a plant out of the ground, and you walk over a couple hundred feet to your right where you've got some plants that are supposed to be green, and you hold them up side by side and go, oh yeah, these are a little bit more yellow. But what do you do with that? So I know I've got an area where the plants are different. Maybe they have a little less nitrogen. I can take the leaf tissue samples, I can send them off for analysis, I can pull some soil samples, but I have no way of changing what I do out there. I can quantify the area, so I can say, oh, okay, I've got this patch, and this patch is 1 acre, whereas I'm in a 300-acre field, so I got an idea about impact on that. But we don't have any technology to be able to change what you apply out there. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So when you want to get an idea about what is my return on my investment, it's kind of hard to say. Right? So return on investment becomes very important. Okay, you guys all know that, but sometimes that gets lost in the mix. So while growers through this whole time were kind of not real sure about this, meanwhile we got a whole lot that's been going on in agricultural research. So USDA and the universities have been very, very active in this. So up through 70s, 80s, into the 90s, a whole lot that has been going on the university and USDA level that are giving us a lot of insight into things that are going on out there. So that allows us, we're kind of building up to where we've got something that can be very applicable. And this is going to be things like understanding the spatial patterns of things out there. So again, a lot of this is corn, soybean, but we're moving into other crops like wheat, sorghum. In Texas here, we did quite a bit. Wheat, sorghum. We actually did some sugar beet stuff up in Amarillo, because believe it or not, Texas at one point actually grew sugar beets. So, little known trivia, right? But trying to understand the spatial distribution of things that are going on out there. So, originally as this was starting, growers didn't take soil samples, right? So, really, when all this started, we didn't have fertilizer, right? It was manure, or it was maybe putting some lime or potash out there. But it wasn't until you have the Green Revolution where you really have nitrogen fertilizer that's cheap enough that you can go out and start applying it to the field. And so originally it was just like, okay, well, I just put a bunch of nitrogen on everywhere. So very similar to what Airfall was talking about. Well, I'm going to spray once a week. And you just put it out, and you get what you get. Oh, my yield's gone up. So one of the things, we're on the research level, we're trying to push growers to take a soil sample. I mean, it's a 300-acre field. Just take one. Right? One is better than none. Right? And we start to look at the variability going on out in the field, and we're starting to push that. Okay, well, one actually isn't enough. You really need to be taking maybe one per acre. And a girl's like, whoa, wait. This 300 samples, right? It's a 300-acre field. Like, you want me to do 300 samples and they're about $10 each to run that? And, we're not doing that. So, well, how many is the right number? And so we've gotten where first it was just take a sample, just take one. And now we're moving to where more and more samples are being taken. So we start to understand that, there is value to that. It's taken a while to get to that point, but as we understand that distribution. Same time, we're looking at spatial patterns for diseases and insects, realizing that they don't all just come in uniformly. Some diseases are going to start at one spot in the field and just going to grow from there. Others are going to kind of be scattered throughout the whole field. Insects may move in from the side of one particular side of the field, moving in off of weeds. Others are going to kind of build gradually across regions of that field. So there's a lot of research that's going on here that's going to set the stage for the next step. And disease detection and quantification. We spent a lot of time looking at this imagery saying, okay, well, we know there's a spot out there. What is it? Can I figure out from that imagery what is causing that? Is it nitrogen? Is it a pest? Is it disease? And so we talk about spectral signatures. Because, remember, we've got 5 bands of data, not just 3, right? We're not just looking at red, green, blue, where we would see a spot out there that's yellow. Well, there's actually more data in that. So we spent a lot of time trying to figure out, is there more information I can draw out of that? So, and then we come down to, okay, well, is it actionable? Right? Because if having information does you no good if you're not going to actually change your behavior. Right? Understanding what insects you have, right? You're out there, you're scouting every week for your whiteflies. Is it going to change how you spray? If you're still just going to spray once a week, then what's the point? Right? The return on investment, that's a harder question. So I'm going to give you a little example. How many of you grow crepe myrtles? All right, so we got a couple. All right, so I have built an app for you, just specifically for you. I've put hundreds of seconds of effort into this. Right? So in ag tech, we would call this slideware. Right? It's not hardware, it's not slideware. Another term for it might be vaporware. Right? Like I said, hundreds of seconds of development effort. Okay? So really fancy. We're going to take a picture of a leaf of a crepe myrtle. And you got to tell the app what variety this is. Okay. So then the app goes in, looks at that leaf, quantifies how much mildew is there, so the ratio of white to green, so gets you a level of quantification. You had to tell it the variety, so it's going to look up that variety and look at the relative susceptibility of that variety, so you kind of know, well, this one's really susceptible, this one's resistant. All of our smartphones have GPS, so it knows where you're at, and it can look up the weather for that location from a couple days ago through the next couple of days. So we start to incorporate some weather into that. Are we in a greenhouse or are we outdoors? So that's going to impact how that disease progresses. All right, so we put all this information together and go, oh, look, there is a 75% chance that spraying for mildew based on these factors is going to actually cost you more than the cost of the disease itself, right? So whether it looks favorable going down the road and all this is great. So show of hands, how many of you are going to change your behavior based on this? right? So how many people say spray? Airfon's talk obviously work really well. Right? Now let's be honest. Like I said, hundreds of seconds of development into this. Right? There's a lot that goes into coming up with that number. I don't know squat about your production. I'm developing a 99-cent app on the Apple's iTunes store. And you're probably not going to change your action based on that. You're going to spray. How many of you tank mix? We got 2 people that tank mix right now. Yeah, pretty much everybody tank mix. You're probably going to be spraying something anyway. So throwing a fungicide into that is not going to really change things that much. This might tell you, well, you can go with one of the fungicides that maybe is a little less effective, right? You don't need to use an expensive fungicide. I mean, maybe it's just some bicarbonate or some different things that you can put out there. But odds are you're probably going to spray. So, particularly with diseases and insects, we're going to tend to err on the side of caution. Right? So, the level of research that has gone into what Airflaw talked about just a minute ago is very different from what I just showed. Right? So, to be able to figure out what you're going to do requires a lot more information than what you can snap with a cell phone and a computer programmer somewhere, in their basement is playing around with, right? So we need to be able to do this research, multiple sites, multiple years, conditions, right? If I were to develop this app for East Texas, that's great. It's probably going to work somewhat okay in East Texas. Is it going to work in California or North Carolina or somewhere else? Probably not. I've got to do this across a lot of different places. And when I'm looking at weather and how that's impacting the development of powdery mildew, every year is different, right? So last year's weather is not the same as the year before. Disease development changes a lot. And then your production practices figure into that heavily on how that is going to manifest itself. So coming back with just like a 75% chance on spraying, that's, to get to that level of information takes a lot more. So if this is something you want to play with, your adoption rate, we kind of see this typically with any ag tech. We see the same thing with a lot of pesticide adoption. You're going to try it out on limited acres. So you're going to take it into a couple of greenhouses. You're going to snap some pictures. A lot of it depends upon how much the app costs, right? If it's 99 cents, sure, I'm going to go snap a bunch of pictures. If this is some program that I'm having to pay, a couple $100 per acre for, I'm going to start really small and see what's going on. If it works, I'm going to try it on a bigger area, and then the next year I'll try it on more. But this is like best case scenario, that you're going to see adoption on 10% of your acres, 30% the next year, 100% the year after that. Typically it's actually going to be much lower. Right? You're not going to go all in right up front. So now there's some things where you have to do everything. Right? If you're going to put out traps to try to attract insects, you're going to use some of the pheromone traps that Airflaw just talked about. One trap probably isn't going to do enough. If your goal is to actually reduce the pest populations through that trap, you got to put out a whole bunch of them. So that changes things. So when we get into the ROI on those decisions, there's a lot that goes into that. Now, university research is going to start to give you an idea about the value. But when you looked at what Airflaw showed about the value for the scout versus the spraying, you have to take those numbers as a starting point. You have to look at how much you're paying your scouts, how much area they're covering. There's a lot of pencil to paper that you have to do on your side to figure out how that's going to work for you. On my side, when I'm trying to determine how much I should charge for this service, a lot of that comes down to economy of scale. Right up front, I know that the first several growers I work with, I'm going to lose money. It's going to take a lot for me to develop that tech to a point that it's actually worthwhile. So my goal here is that when I develop that for a handful of growers, I'm going to be able to extrapolate from that to more and more growers. So, but it's a little hard from my side to figure out how much should I be charging for that service. So, and obviously if I can't come up with a good price for you, then your ROI looks different. So, and typically when we go to this 10, 30, 100 adoption rate, you're not going to, again, put all your eggs in one basket. So you may be doing multiple things at a time. So you've got one scout running around with a fancy camera taking pictures of all this stuff. Meanwhile, you're still doing your regular scouting. So there's some cost up front for you as you're evaluating this tech as to whether or not it's worth adopting it. You can't stop what you're already doing, because what do you have to compare it to? So I'm going to spend a little more time on aerial imagery. I'm going to, so there's, because we've been doing it for so long, there's some illustrations here on how things have changed for ag tech over that time. So when we take aerial imagery, pretty well developed for corn, cotton, soybean, things like that. But your trees look nothing like that, right? You could actually think about those types of crops as being flat. And once you get row closure, you're basically looking at a whole lot of green plants. They were seeded, so your genotype for a single plant is going to be virtually the same across that entire field. So one plant here looks very much like a plant on the other side of the field. Or even if we're talking about things like corn that are grown over multiple states, a corn plant in Nebraska looks very similar to a corn plant grown in Indiana and Texas. So much more similar than two different tree crops that you're growing side by side here in East Texas. Okay. So when we get to horticultural crops, we have to start thinking about these as being three-dimensional crops. That structure is different. We're looking at shadowing. So this is cacao, and you see these holes in between the canopy. So and the difference between this row and this row is how they're pruning those. So that's a pruning trial. They're trying to figure out optimal pruning methods. Well, that shadow plays a role in what you get from the data that you are able to act upon from that. And what resolution are you going to need to be able to capture that? If you come in with really high resolution, you see these holes in that canopy, and you can actually measure that. If we were to take the same imagery with a lower resolution, this I think is 4 centimeters. So each pixel is that big. You're looking at a very small area of the crop for each pixel. If we go to higher resolution, so say we go to 8, we're getting a much bigger square. We're starting to average the bright green areas with the dark areas. Right? If you're looking at satellite imagery for that same thing, about the best you can do right now is 40 centimeter pixels. So your pixel, each pixel, is covering about half of that tree, which means you're going to have some pixels that are going to be in the middle here. You're going to show a lot of green. You're going to have a lot of pixels over there on the edge. So half the picture is getting soil, the other half is getting foliage. You're averaging those two together. So when we get into horticultural crops, we have to go with a much, much higher resolution than what you would with corn, right? So if I've got a pixel that's 5 meters, right? So basically the size of this stage, that's pretty good for corn, right? I'm looking at patterns that are much larger than that in corn. I'm looking at changes in soil texture, a little bit of topography changes, so maybe you've got an area where some water is standing a little more. Those are occurring on a scale that's much higher than 40 centimeters. So that, 40 centimeter imagery, that is considered ultra high resolution for those types of crops, not for horticultural crops. We really don't do anything with a lower resolution than 8 centimeters. So we're looking at an area this big per pixel or smaller. If we're looking at small trees, we're looking at 2 centimeter imagery, right? 1 inch. So, but you think about it, I've got a new tree. It's got a foot diameter to the canopy. When viewed from the top, right? So we're looking straight down at that tree. I need a few more pixels in there than 1 pixel that covers that whole tree. So I'm looking at 2 centimeter imagery, 1 inch. I'm going to get 12 pixels going across the tree. Right? So we change things a lot in how we approach these. I'm looking at the side of the trees. Right? Some of the crops, we look at, say, apple. They grow these in what they call a fruiting wall. So it's about a 14-foot trellis, right? Wires about every 1.5 feet. And the tree, each one of them is 1 foot to 2 feet apart, growing along there. They're growing straight up, and they're pruned so that the canopy is really about that wide, right? As it's just a long hedge. When you look at that from above, you're seeing a little tiny circle that is the top of that tree. Whereas that whole 14-foot canopy, you're missing that because you're looking from straight down. So we really need to be looking at those from the side, and that's a whole different kind of technology where you're trying to view the side of the tree from a bunch of pictures that were taken directly overhead. So there's a lot of complexity that goes into that. All right. And that pretty much brings us up to where we're at today with aerial imagery. So, so then things change. Late 90s, we get the first yield monitors. Again, corn, soybean, cotton. This changes everything. Right, so when we're talking about pests and insects and things, we're erring on the side of caution where we're like, okay, I know how much my spray is going to cost. I'm really trying to estimate what my damage is going to be. I'm looking at these graphs of my whitefly populations over time, what the airflow was showing. I'm going up and down. I'm trying to make an educated guess as to which level is actionable there. At what point am I going to see more damage than the cost of the spray? But when I've got yield, I know for each area that unit is measuring, which is typically around 10 meter sections across the width of that combine there. I know how much money I made on that square, and the square next to that, and the square next to that. I know what my production costs are across the whole field, so I can start to look at that map and say, this section of ground right here made me $10. That section over there cost me $5. So I can act on that. It's a no-brainer. What's going on over there where I'm losing money versus what's going on right here where I'm making money? So do I need to put more fertilizer on over there? Or maybe less fertilizer? I mean, if I double my fertilizer rate over on this section of ground where my yield is lower, is my yield going to come up enough that it's now going to become profitable? Or am I just throwing good money after bad? Maybe I shouldn't put any fertilizer on over there. Maybe that's my better choice. I come to this section that's making me money, if I double my fertilizer application here at this site, I might double my yield. So my, cost-benefit analysis changes dramatically. It is difficult to make some of those decisions just off of looking at a yield map. You really want to bring in other data sources on top of that. So, and that's going to be things like even just soil samples. So I get my GPS out, I go to that section where I'm making money, I pull a sample there, I go to another section where I'm losing money, take a sample there, send them back, look at what's different with those, right? Even just feeling my soil, right? Everybody did that in their introductory soil sample. It's like, oh, this soil over here has more clay, this one over here is more of a loam. So I've got a better soil here than what I have over there. I start to make changes based on that. So now that we've got this, and we've got a direct economic driver for this, then we start seeing the development of more technology. So the next thing that comes out is going to be variable rate technology. So this is an almond field. This is about 300 acres here that's put out here. And we're looking at the size of the trees there. It's canopy volume across there. And you can see a little bit easier on my screen than yours, but there's some minor trends going across here where there's some better growth than others. You can see a little bit lower growth over here. This is a different irrigation sector, so probably not putting as much water on over there as they should be. When you walk out in the field and look at these, you would never know that there is a difference out there. The difference that we're seeing in terms of plant size from these higher areas versus these lower areas, these are maybe a foot shorter. And this is on a 25, 30-foot tree, so it's really hard to see that. When we get to the top edge, you can start to see that there's enough changes there that you're starting to pick up that those trees aren't doing quite as well. But I've got an idea about what's going on across that field, so I can start to make changes. So first thing, I gotta know where I'm at. Now your cell phone has a GPS in it, right? Well, this thing's gonna tell me I'm somewhere in this room, right? It's not great. We get what we call RTK GPS systems, or real-time kinematic. So GPS all by itself is variable. So your location, according to a high-end GPS system, is going to fluctuate by roughly a meter over the course of the day. So we put one system in one spot and ask it to measure that location over and over and over again. And it's like, okay, I know I'm staying put, but my sensors are telling me that I'm moved half a meter this way right now, and then later this afternoon I'm a half meter over there. We start to send corrections to another unit that's out driving through the field. And, oh, okay. So now we can get systems where we're down 1 to 2 centimeter accuracy on that. So as we start driving through this field, we can know better exactly where we're at, and we can start making those changes in our fertilizer rate or irrigation rates, whatever it is that we're changing across there, based on where we're actually located, particularly like with spraying. Once you have this, you can tell whether your spray booms are overlapping. Are you doubling up on your pesticide application on some of these rows because you just got off a little bit? Everybody's heard about self-driving tractors and all that. So all of this is coming from the fact that we now know exactly how much money that little square of land is actually worth. Right? So we have seen the technology for variable rate is actually pretty simple, and then you attach that to a number of different implements. So if we're talking about a spreader, typically, if you're going to go put lime out in the field or fertilizer or something, there's a crank that somebody's going to adjust to be able to put out 100 pounds per acre or 125. Well, we just put a motor on that. So if we drive through the field, that crank is going up and down depending upon where you're located. So we've even gotten into some really fancy stuff where we're changing seeding rate where we're at in the field, or even possibly changing what seed we put down. Right? So we got hundreds and hundreds of varieties of corn. Well, let's change. Some of these do better on clay soil, but this is a higher clay soil. We'll put those out here. And this area over here that's a little more sandy, we'll change varieties. So we can start to change as we go through the field. Now, the challenge with that right now is, that's a nice, pretty map, but this is what we typically see with those variable rate technology things. The zones that are drawn are really, really big. They're on the order of multiple acres. So, and in a lot of cases, some of the guys I've talked to that are doing this, they're literally drawing these by hand. They look at a picture like this and say, yeah, I think I'm going to draw a circle around here, and let's include that in it. And we kind of got this stripe across here, so we're going to put a circle on that. The technology for developing these maps is pretty crude. So now one of the things that we see right now with ag tech that is really driving a lot of things is being able to take that kind of data and turn it into a better map. So that's getting much, much better. And for instance, rather than looking at multiple acres, I'm looking at individual trees here. So my map looks like this, where I'm actually able to go in and adjust my rate. And this is actually a pretty crude map, because this is just based on 5 levels. Pretty much all variable rate controllers can handle this right now. Some of the newer ones will handle 256 levels, so that map actually looks closer to this. The problem is I've got thousands and thousands of polygons that I'm drawing out there, and some of the controllers don't like that so much. It's a little bit too complex. So there's this constant back and forth of we develop tech in one area and we have to wait for the other areas to catch up. So if you're dealing with a map that looks like this, as a company that develops variable rate controllers, there's no reason to develop the tech to handle a map like this. So now that we've got the tech to develop a map like this, now we got to wait for the controllers to catch up. And now that we got really good controllers, well, then we can do better maps. So it's this constant back and forth. So to kind of give you an overview now, then, where we're at today. There's still a huge focus on corn, cotton, soybeans, wheat, large acreage crops. So most of the ag tech is focused on those because it's an economy of scale, right? They're not really high value crops. I mean, the value per acre of a greenhouse crop in East Texas is orders of magnitude higher than cotton that's grown a few counties over from here. But if I develop tech for cotton in Texas, I can probably apply that across the entire Southeast and probably even Arizona and California. So my value proposition for that changes quite a bit. So we still see that in really driving a lot of the tech development. For crops like that, as I was saying, your things that are varying are things like soil or topography, things like that. So it's occurring on a really high scale. So we're dealing with zones rather than individual trees. In this particular field, some of these yellow spots you see here, those are almond trees that had bud failure. So third year into this field here, they saw bud failure on these trees, cut them out, put new trees in place. So we go all of a sudden from, say a 4-year-old tree here to a 1-year-old tree there. That's a lot of variation that we're having to deal with. So we get down to that tree by tree level, it really does matter. One of the things you guys pride yourself on is that one pot of tree or one pot of poinsettia looks very much like another one, but you know that they're not identical. Right? And if you were growing poinsettias over multiple years, one plant, the longer they go, the more variable they are. You see that with your trees and your shrubs. You get a lot more variation from what they look like 6 weeks after they rooted to what they look like when they're ready to be shipped out a year, 2, 3 years later. So we end up with a lot of, one of my growers described it as these guys are coming to me and they're trying to bring their round pegs and fit them in my square hole, right? I grow trees, I don't grow corn, I don't grow cotton. So you're trying to take tech developed for those and put them into a situation where, yeah, that tree is different from the one right next to it. So that is the challenge that you guys are going to have as these guys are coming to you with these great ideas, and they sound wonderful, but it's not, it might work in some places, it doesn't work in others. We are getting some really interesting stuff being developed for tree crops in California. So I'll show you a little bit of that stuff in a second here. But there you're dealing with, say, almonds that are grown from Bakersfield up to Chico. So the entire Central Valley of California is covered in almonds. Well, that's a lot of acres, and it's a really high value crop. So, that stuff, the economy makes sense there. Still, a lot of this is zone-based, and some of that is just because of the tech. But some of it is still that round peg mentality. So, some of the aerial imagery companies there that are making a lot of progress, they're still flying at 40 centimeters. That's 2 or 3 pixels per tree, right? And most of those pixels are going to have some dirt mixed in there. We see a lot of stuff in Florida where citrus in Florida looks completely different from citrus in California because we actually have rain in Florida. California, well, they have irrigation. So we have grass as our row middles. Right? Because if you try to keep your field as bare ground and you're getting rain at least once a week, well, that doesn't work. We've got weeds that come up underneath the canopy. We try to maintain a herbicide strip underneath there to keep it relatively clean, but nobody tries to keep it perfectly clean. I mean, would be cost prohibitive. Right? So you can tolerate a certain amount of weed cover under there. California, man, there's nothing under those trees. It is bare dirt as far as the eye can see. And if you're trying to do image analysis stuff, bright green tree versus dirt looks a whole lot different from a bright green tree with weeds underneath it and bright green grass in the middle, things like that. So even where you're looking at tech that is working in one area doesn't mean that it translates to that tech working where you're at. So you get a lot of variability here. All right, so that gets you kind of up to speed on where we're at right now. So I'm going to give you some ideas about things that I think are going to become available to you guys in the not too distant future. I'm going to jump to pest trap monitoring first, since Erfan just talked about that. So this is a pest trap right here. It's got a yellow sticky card inside of it, and it's got a camera. Now in this case, it's got a pheromone in there. This is going after navel orangeworm, which is not really a big issue on navel oranges. It's more of an issue on almonds and pistachios. And you all have seen this where you open your bag of pistachios and you're cracking them and they all look great except one of them has kind of black and crusty stuff inside of there. Don't eat that. Well, that's navel orangeworm that got into that nut and is causing damage, and now they're really nasty. So in this case, you're pretty much only going to have naval armed work going into that trap. So currently, they use that camera, they record what's inside of that, and if there's a bug that's more or less a certain size, then we're going to call it naval armed worm. You're going to count on a daily basis. They're doing some stuff, some interesting things where they're starting to use some machine learning to try to identify what's in there. So this may actually get to the point where rather than having a pheromone in there, you can have just a regular yellow sticky trap if they've got the right size camera, right resolution, everything. Where some of the traps that Airfon was showing, you might actually be able to differentiate between the white fly and which aphid was it? The woolly aphid. Maybe. I mean, there's some really cool stuff that's being done with analysis, right? You're on everybody's phone now. You look at somebody and you go, oh, it identifies your face, right? It can tell who you are. So that's coming. Right now, this is great for naval orangeworm. It's not a stretch to take that tech and apply it to other crops. And that will eventually trickle down to basically your entire industry. The other thing that's kind of interesting on this, with the pheromone traps, they are also putting out pheromones as a release for mating disruption. And this particular company, I'm not going to mention any names, but this particular company has turned around and put sensors inside of that trap, inside of the aerosol that's measuring temperature and humidity and I think pressure. And they've got these, let's see, one of the fields I was in, every 10 rows, every 14 trees, they've got one of these emitters out there. And they're starting to measure temperature, humidity inside of canopy. Most places are going to have one weather station per farm. So when you drive out of the station here, you look over in the grass area, you'll see the weather station out there. Right? Big, open, grassy field with one station. That's kind of the standard setup. You want a big open area so you can measure temperature, humidity, everything consistently. These are inside of the canopy. So when they're looking at frost in that field, the temperatures you get inside of the canopy, where you're actually going to have the damage, are very different from what's in that station that's off all by itself. And there's a lot of factors that go into that, like topography, canopy density, and things like that. But you're able to get a much more accurate estimate of your frost damage. Well, that same tech, right, not the mating disruption part of it, but the temperature humidity thing in a mesh network where you've got this communication going back and forth, that can easily be applied to put a couple of those in every single greenhouse. Now, how many of you don't have heat in your greenhouses, and every time we've got a heavy frost, you spend your night driving from house to house to house, checking on the little heaters that you put in there? Well, wouldn't it be cool if you could pull up on your phone and see what the temperature is in every single house and go, hey, house number 12 is starting to get low. I better go over there and check that heater. It's probably out of fuel. And I go load it up. Right? So you spend a lot more time sitting in your truck with the heater going and a lot less time getting out of your truck and checking the house and then getting to the next one, so on and so forth. So the tech is there, and it will come to your industry eventually. So soil moisture, so depending upon what crops it is you're growing, that tech is really well developed. The big thing with it a lot of times is getting the data manipulated into the right place. So as these mesh networks are being developed, the same tech as the temperature and humidity, we start to measure soil moisture. Going from house to house, having to get that logger there, download data, move it back and forth, that becomes very tedious. So you don't really see that being adopted. But if we have that on a mesh network, then the sensor in house 1 talks to the sensor in house 2, 3, 4, 5, and your office is out by house 12. That data has bounced all the way from that house that way over on one side of your farm back to your office. It's on the other side. So that communication network is becoming fairly mature at this point. And so it's just a question of what kind of sensors you're going to hang off of that. So that is coming. There's some interesting stuff when you're looking at field crops. I kind of stuck these down here at the bottom because they're not necessarily that applicable to you guys right now, but the being able to go in and measure soil texture instead of pull a sample, feel it with your hands, send it off to the lab, they can actually drive over it with a sensor that's measuring changes in things like electromagnetic conductivity of the soil over a meter square. And so you can see really interesting changes on that. If you've ever looked at a NRCS soil map, basically you're going to have one soil type covering this pretty much whole station here, maybe a band of something else. This is going to give you similar, but on a meter by meter basis. So you were putting multiple data sets together to be able to get an idea about what's going on. So some cool stuff and some not so cool stuff. So if you're in a greenhouse, you already have a lot of automation to that. Even if it's just a hoop house and you're rolling up sides and things like that, that's a much different situation than, corn, right? So we start to get more automation with the irrigation. Probably a lot of you don't go open irrigation valves manually. You've got solenoids on those, and you say, okay, I'm going to water this house for 1 hour. And off it goes. You don't have to remember to come back in an hour and turn that water off. Right? So there's still a lot of manual stuff to it, but as you improve that automation, then the more you get of that, the more it frees up your labor. And really, labor is what's driving a lot of this technology. That's why you're seeing a lot of it in California in nut crops, where they don't get to just pay their guys $10 an hour. It's $10 an hour plus it's overtime, triple overtime. It's a very challenging state for labor laws. So imagery and thermal for greenhouses. The challenge with this is how do you collect the data? So you've all seen some really cool stuff where there's drones that are flying through rooms. Well, the drone we use is a $10,000 drone, and we hang a $4,000 camera off of that. If that hits something, it's a carbon fiber frame. Carbon fiber doesn't bend, it doesn't bounce, it shatters. Right? So I just lost $1,400 like that because somebody left a cart in the greenhouse over there that wasn't supposed to be there. Right? So there's a lot of stuff in terms of being able to hang sensors off of it and be able to manipulate a lot of that and a lot of autonomous capability. But pretty much most of the ones that really are functional inside right now, they hang a frame around the thing. And there's some really cool ones that you see for like search and rescue where they'll send these into a burning building and see if there's anybody there, and it's cool, but it's got a frame around it. And they're great to watch at the trade shows because they take this thing and they throw it into this cage. They use these big mesh cages to, like on a trampoline so your kids don't go flying out. Well, these things bounce around. So they hit the cage and they bounce and they go to the next one. That's how they're actually measuring what's going on out there. So throw one of these in your greenhouse, watch it bounce all around, bounce onto the top of your plants. It only takes one hit. So, we're a ways away from being able to run drones through a greenhouse to be able to measure stuff. Now, for nursery, on the other hand, as long as you know where your power lines are, and those don't move too often, you can use drones and get really good imagery. I'm perfectly happy to put my $14,000 drone up in a situation like that. The LiDAR, it's not ready yet. Right? So we're working on it. It'll get there for nursery crops. It'll be great because you're able to measure your trunk diameter, your tree height. Also, you have an inventory where you actually know the caliper of your trees out there instead of, I measured 3 or 4 of them, I've got an inventory now. When you call me and say, okay, I want to order 50 trees and I need them to be a 3-inch caliber, I can look on my computer and say, oh yeah, I've got this many in stock right now. Well, I got some 2.5, so if you want a little bit lower price. So the aerial applications. So I think this will actually come fairly soon to your crops versus some other crops. If I'm trying to spray corn, I can't afford to put a drone up and be able to do sprays. The drones don't fly that long. They've got a relatively short battery life. They can't hold a lot of material, but they've got really good coverage. So you're not putting out the same gallons per acre. You're putting out the same amount of product per acre, but with a lower rate. But this is just a huge fan blowing down. So we're seeing some really good stuff with aerial application technology. Some are even to the point where they have a little cartridge that has your chemical in it. So the drone lands, you pop a new cartridge in, you pop a new battery in the drone, you hit a button and it takes off and it goes again. And it's going to the hot spots out there and spraying. It isn't something that you're necessarily going to use where you're trying to treat your entire farm. But a lot of your nurseries that I've seen, you have a section that's maybe the size of this room that has one crop, and then you've got a completely different crop right next to that. Well, you get out your big air blast sprayer and try to cover this room, you're not going to spray just this spot, right? You're going to just basically spray everything on that row. Well, I could actually come in and I could spray just this spot and skip. Maybe it's just another variety next door, But if I don't have the pest there, I don't have the disease, I can start to do what we would consider variable rate application out there based on the structure of your actual facility. So disease, pest identification apps, the ones that have lots of pictures that will help you look at something by eye. So you get Airfon Sticky Trap, get your fancy little camera here, and you look at something, and then you go through the app and you look at something else. That's great. Getting to the point where we've got image, image recognition, where you can pick out one insect versus another, we're still a ways away from that. So maybe that'll come. Right now, as I was saying with the other one, pheromone traps, sure. But that's because we're attracting one kind of insect. Or maybe we put 2 or 3 pheromones in there and we're attracting maybe 3 kinds of insects. But if they look different enough, then we can identify that. But, you can find apps out there where you're like, oh, I don't know what this tree is. And you snap a picture and it tells you what the tree is. Do you guys use that for your inventory? I don't think so. All right. So, yeah. So the next big thing is integration of data sources. And it's surprising that this is still considered the next big thing. And it's the next big thing for corn and soybean as well as your stuff. Yeah. So everything needs to talk to everything else. Right? And right now, everything is silent, where the guys that develop the soil moisture sensors don't want to talk to anybody else. So it's very frustrating. Okay, so trees don't look like corn. And I think you can see why there's a lot of complexity that goes into this, and that's why things have been slow to come to you guys. So for the green industry, for you guys here, you're going to see companies that have really interesting things at some of these shows. Absolutely talk to them and check it out for yourself. But if you're an early adopter, if this is a brand new company, they're trying to figure things out. Now, there's a big advantage. If you get in on the ground floor, as they are developing their tech, they will be developing it for you and then trying to apply that to other growers. So you get to help direct where that tech goes. You're getting them to make their peg fit your square hole. Right? But it's not going to work up front. It's going to take a while, and development always seems to take longer than you think. Oh, it should be easy to do this. No, it's not. It's easy to do it once. It's easy to do a proof of concept. But there's a huge difference between something that works one time, one field, one grower, to something that is actually applicable across an industry. So the size of the company is going to help you understand what's going on. If this is a 2 or 3 guy operation, you're going to be looking at early adoption. On the other hand, if they've got a decent sized team and they're covering thousands of acres, right, that's a very different story. And start small, 10, 30, 100. So that's what I got. Okay. So thanks for coming.